something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware.
Hi, my name's Joe Tyndall, and this is actually our 25th episode of Occupy TV. We've done these over the last 4 months. Not quite 4 months, but 25 episodes. And I'm with Stan Taylor, and we're going to talk about a bunch of stuff, but specifically about the Lane Community College Peace Center Peace Symposium. It's going to be held on April 20th and 21st of this month, and so tell us about it.
Well, this is our 5th annual Peace Symposium, so we started in 2008. Mm-hmm. And it's grown kind of as we've moved along. The first Peace Symposium, we had Medea Benjamin from Code Pink. Mm-hmm. The second, we had David Solnit, who was one of the primary organizers for the nonviolent direct action movement in Seattle in protesting the WTO in 1999. The third year, we had Tom Hayden. And last year, we had Colleen Cisfranco and Mark Franco from the Winnemem Wintu tribes. Mm-hmm. But this year, our symposium is both a symposium and a democracy convergence. It's really in the spirit of the Occupy movement, and it's called People-Powered Democracy Confronts Corporate Rule. And we have some fabulous, really some of the top democracy activists in the country coming in for this symposium, both to give keynote talks and to engage in organizing workshops.
Okay, so let's go down through the speakers list. We got a flyer right here, and so I guess David Barsamian's the first, so I know about him. So go ahead.
Yeah, of course, David is the founder and director of Alternative Radio. Mm-hmm. One of the things that's interesting about David at this moment is that he just did a series of interviews with Richard Wolff, mm-hmm. and Richard Wolff is the Marxist economist that wrote Capitalism Hits the Fan. And those interviews have been put into a new book that's due out May 1st, so right after the symposium, that is called Occupy the Economy. Okay. So it fits right in with the Occupy movement. And yeah, it should be fabulous to have that book and David here talking about those things. And he's going to do actually 2 talks at the symposium. Okay. One on Saturday, or one on Friday night, excuse me, mm-hmm. as part of a plenary panel. That's called Uprisings, Kashmir to Cairo to Wall Street. Okay. And then on Saturday, he's going to do a presentation called Fantasies of Capitalism.
Okay, so let's talk about capitalism for a little bit. Then we can go down and grab the rest of the speakers. But so I've expressed a number of times to people that I think we're sort of at end game, the kind of death throes of capitalism. So let's talk about that kind of thing. What capitalism's worked, shall we say, reasonably well for a while, as most people seem to think, but has it actually really worked well, and why is it starting to be a problem?
I think there are several reasons it's starting to be a problem. One of the primary ones is that since the 1970s, since the time of Nixon, mm-hmm. the economy has been attached to finance capitalism. And many people don't really recognize that in the 1970s, 1971 specifically, Nixon made a choice. Instead of subsidizing U.S. manufacturing to make it competitive, mm-hmm. He decided to attach U.S. political power to global finance. And from that time forward, what we've seen is that finance capitalism has been involved in the foreign policy of the United States in the form of creating debt structures that the U.S. through the IMF and World Bank is able to utilize to restructure and take away the sovereignty of other countries. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that's happening with the economic system is that since the 1970s, it's become increasingly debt-based. Mm-hmm. And that's true for the third world. It's now true for Western Europe with the austerity measures that are being imposed. And it's also true for the United States. So if you look at workers in the United States, you'll see that beginning in the mid-1970s, wages stagnated, And as they stagnated, the corporations that made fantastic profits, because even though wages stagnated, productive capacity of the workers continued to increase. And because the workers were producing more and not getting that back in the form of increased wages, that turned into increased profits for corporations, which then in turn led them to turn around and lend that back to workers in the United States in the form of consumer credit. And so what we have since the 1970s is a increasing debt load for workers in the United States, and also in order to keep consumption at high levels, working longer hours. So you have both men and women in the workforce working an average of 48 hours a week, which is the equivalent of 6 more weeks a year than in 1970. So we've reached a point now, given the bubble cracking in terms of or bursting in terms of the mortgage crisis, that when you begin to look at where our economy stands, people cannot afford to take out more debt, and they can't afford to work more. So the spots to expand into for a debt-based economy are gone.
So, I mean, we have a lot of what you just said brought up a lot of issues. I mean, first, along in the early 70s, we also saw the Powell letter, which brought about a change in the way corporate America communicated with the public, that they began funding to the tune of several $billion a year, a system of think tanks to generate sort of a pro-corporate mythology that's been pushed out into the society. I mean, Fox News basically saw a pile of money that they were offering to, be the cheerleader for that, and basically took the money and has promoted that particular point of view. I mean, Clear Channel's another example. They saw the money, and we have things like Rush Limbaugh on there. Rush, I guess, is making $50 million a year, putting out, essentially spewing the line that comes out of the corporate think tanks.
Yeah, it reminds me of Jim Page's line, the singer Jim Page's line, Rush Limbaugh, the $1 Million Jaw.
Yeah. So we have that. I guess we go back to, I certainly have been tracking it since 1983, and I know that if we correct for inflation, that median household income in 1983 was $43,000, expressed in 2011 dollars. Whereas today, at the end of 2011, median household income had reached $50,000. So here we have essentially 30 years from 1982, enormous productivity gains, and yet it remains, relatively stagnant. It's essentially gone up about 8 or 9%, and that's about it in terms of effective purchasing power. But included in that is the fact that more people are actually working in a given household, and they are working more hours to earn that. So essentially, the working class has not participated at all in the productivity gains, as had happened in my parents' generation. I mean, we had an improving standard of living during the 50s and the 60s that kind of peaked and has leveled off in the 70s.
I think that's true. If you look at the analysis that Richard Wolff does, he does exactly that analysis that you're talking about, of tracing productivity really from the start of the United States forward, and that always from the beginning of this country forward until the 1970s, productivity gains had been essentially captured by the working class, which gave them increased levels of well-being and increased expectations of consumption that kind of changed their mindset as well to a consumer-based society. I also think you're absolutely right about the Powell letter and that era in the early 1970s being a turning point. One of the groups that I think is very interesting is the Trilateralist Commission. And the Trilateralist Commission, it's called the Trilateralist Commission because it brings together businesses from Europe, Japan, and the United States, hence trilateralist. And basically, that was a period of time after the Civil Rights Movement and after the anti-war Vietnam War movement and the various movements, environmental movement, the farm workers movements, the gay rights movements, the women's movements in the 60s and early 70s that had some success, that once Nixon was removed from the White House, there was kind of, I think, a big sigh of relief from most of the people on the left and moved towards inaction. And at that point in time, business stepped in and began to engage in a counter-revolution from what had happened. And for the Trilateralist Commission, they wrote a report in 1975, written by Samuel Huntington, a conservative political scientist. And the report basically said that there was a crisis in democracy. That was the title of the report. And the report said that the crisis of democracy was that too many people were participating in democracy.
Funny on that one.
It's,
yeah, we changed a lot. I mean, the 60s happened, and it's interesting because that really was my parents' generation, our parents' generation, that that created an enormously liberal society in the sense that we passed legislation to clean up the environment. We said it's no longer okay to discriminate in housing. It's no longer okay to refuse people of color the vote. It's no longer okay to lynch black men, etc. And the other thing was they said, enough with war. And so things sort of quieted down after those problems kind of started to get solved. But the thing that I noticed, because by the mid-70s I had graduated from college and I'm in my first job and have a huge student debt loan, nothing compared to what people are carrying today. I walked away, went to MIT as an undergraduate, I walked away with, I guess, about $60,000 worth of debt, all totaled. And it's, it took me a while to pay it off. I was still paying it off into the early 90s, but finally, it went away. But I mean, people today, it's not common at all for people to walk away with well over $100,000 in debt.
Well, it's true that right now the average college student from that graduates with a 4-year degree graduates with $24,000 worth of debt, and that's the average. Which means it doesn't include
it's not even as bad as I thought.
Well, but you have to understand that doesn't include. That includes everybody from people whose parents pay for the college so that they don't have any debt, to people who basically have to borrow everything to have the debt. So what that means is for middle and lower class people, where they're actually taking out the loans, it's $40,000 or $50,000 by the time you end a 4-year degree, let alone talking about moving on to a graduate degree of any kind where the costs pile up even faster in the process. And I think it's extraordinary when you think about, again, the time frame that we grew up. I was born in 1951 and went to college in the 60s and early 70s. And in most places after World War II, states set up public institutions that were basically state subsidized. I grew up in Kansas, and if you graduated from a Kansas high school with a C average or better, you were automatically admitted into a state institution. And I remember my second year in college, the tuition was $100 a semester. $100 a semester. Yeah. The rest was basically subsidized through tax dollars by the people in the state. And again, if you think about that era, as you say, our parents' generation coming out of World War II, all sorts of things were set up, Medicare and Medicaid and educational subsidies that essentially saw these things as public goods, public health and public education as public goods that needed to be provided to the public to create a decent society.
Yeah, a sense of caring for the commons. I think, that I didn't feel was there in the late 50s, early 60s, but by the end of the 60s was really there. I mean, even my father came around on a lot of that stuff. But just I sort of misspoke earlier. I think I said $60,000 in debt, but it's 16. And so I'm getting old. The wrong words are popping out more regularly than I would have thought. But at that time, that was more than my starting salary, and by a considerable amount. So, it took me a long time to pay that off.
Well, and if you go back to what you were beginning to talk about with students today, and you recognize that students are graduating from a four-year institution with $40,000 or $50,000 worth of debt, and if they go on to a graduate school with $100,000 to $200,000 worth of debt, essentially they are being enslaved in that process, because their choices about what they can do when they graduate are considerably narrowed, because they have to service that debt, as a framework. And that's becoming increasingly problematic, because in an economy that's turned down, and we can talk about why that's happened, students are being told, graduates are being told, when you graduate, expect that you're going to work 4 or 5 different kinds of jobs over the course of your lifetime, and the likelihood is that the highest paying one will be your first job, and as you get moving down the line after having been displaced from one to the other, that your expectations will be that each time will be lower. It's, I think, a real legitimate question for people who are entering college to ask whether it's a reasonable thing to do given the outcomes. And I think myself that that's part of what's being engineered, is that the expectation that people will actually graduate from college is being undermined by a debt-based structure that suggests it's not a good investment.
Yeah, and we're actually seeing the outright refusal to pay various fees and taxes on the part of corporations. I was reading somewhere that if we just took the stuff. In other words, every time there's a transaction with a mortgage, say, you're supposed to record the deeds and the like. And one of the things that's happened is that there's been literally millions of mortgages around the country that have been traded and refinanced, and none of those fees that usually go to pay for the recording with the counties. I mean, it's either the county or the state, however it's set up in that area. And you pay certain fees to have these deeds recorded. And right now it was estimated that in Lane County, that the transactions that banks have simply not paid fees and not recorded stuff comes up to $4.2 million.
No, that's news to me. It's interesting.
Which would have taken, if Bank of America and the other financing companies had paid the fees to do the title work, which they are, of course, required to do, that Lane County would not be hurting for money. We have, actually, it was kind of interesting today. I was at the gym, and they had this thing, breaking news. It was the thing about the president talking, and apparently he went off script and was talking about all of these cases where various groups say, hey, we're just not going to pay, and so transferring, taxes to those least able to pay it. The flip side on looking at, say, median household income is looking at, how much money the uber rich have. I mean, people who are really at the top, the ones who are essentially paying for the think tanks that the Powell letter does, who are hiring corporate managers to figure out how to extract wealth faster, that kind of stuff. And if you chart that against or take the ratio, the thing that I've been looking at is just the Forbes 400 list, which is proudly published every October, second issue, and looking at person number 400. And in 1982, which was the first year that they did that list, it took $91 million to get on the list, and median household income was $19,000. Today, you have to have $1.05 billion to get on the list, and as person number 400, and median household income in current dollars is $50,000. So, but if we correct for inflation, we see that while the amount of wealth you have to take is about 11 times what it originally was, a little bit more than that, household income is about not even quite 3 times. It's a little bit less than 3 times. So, we've got almost a factor of 4 increase in the amount of wealth that the uber rich hold as compared to working people. And it's been an enormous increase.
Yeah, it's a myth about the rising tide lifts all boats kind of framework. I don't know if you saw Pearson when he was in town discussing exactly these statistics that you're talking about. And his research shows that if you really look at where the gains are, it's actually not just to the top 1%, it's to the top 1% of the 1%.
Right. Yeah, the Forbes 400 is the 1% of the 1% of the 1%.
Right.
And it's interesting that that group, that 400 people, now holds more wealth than the bottom 3/4 of the American population. And we're at about 310 million people right now. So that's somewhere in the range of 230 million people. I mean, 230 million, which is just a staggering figure.
Yeah, those figures, I haven't seen those as recently as you probably have, but it's the same kind of data that, if you look at the top 400 people in terms of wealth and ask yourself, how much do they have relative to the entire world, that they have wealth equivalent to the bottom 45% of the world population. And you've got 7 billion people in the world, so you're talking 3.5 billion people compared to 400 people. So, talk about inequality.
The thing is that oftentimes when you talk to conservatives about this, you sort of get a social Darwinism response in that, well, you just don't like successful people. And these people are successful because they're disciplined and they're moral and, they've made the right choices and they're more evolved than you are. And, if you got your act together, then you too could be rich. But the flip side is how is a lot of this money being generated? I mean, one of the things that, the issue of growth was brought up earlier in the conversation. We have to have growth. I got to have growth. It's always got to grow. And why is that the case? Why is growth so important? Okay, I think there's a lot of reasons for that. One is that, you essentially have a pie every year. And out of that pie, the uber rich take a slice. Well, every succeeding year, they take a bigger slice. Okay, so we've got this pie, but the pie grows a little bit, but they take an extra wedge. Okay, now the question is, you got this little ring on the outside, which is the growth, and then you lose this slice right here that they've taken. Now the question is, which is bigger, the little growth around the ring on the outside, or that slice? And if the slice is, and they've basically been roughly equal. So in other words, the working class has stayed the same. I mean, 1982 corrected for inflation, median household income is $43,000. Today it's $50,000. So in other words, that slice and the ring have been largely the same size.
Well, and of course, if you take that a step further and ask yourself, okay, out of that ring, that's that's still with the 99%, you start dicing down the 99% to see who has gained for the median household income.
Right.
You'll see a whole bunch of people who fall well below that median household income who have actually lost ground during this period.
Lost ground hugely, all the way to being homeless.
Yeah.
I mean, I not myself directly, but I'm a single male. I've never been married, don't have any kids. And so I wind up living in group houses. And 2 years ago, one of my roommates was a woman named Katie. And all of a sudden, her sister shows up with her husband, and they're in the car, and they got all their junk in their car. And so, I think I was just coming for a visit, but nope. What happened with them is that both of them, they had a house, they had 2 nice cars, they're both working. She got sick. Okay, so the insurance company said they had health insurance. The insurance company says, no, we're not paying. So there went the life savings. Okay, there went, they sold the 2 cars, and they still have the house. But then shortly after that, the company he's working for moves his operations over to China. So they shut the thing down. It's a big employer. Now there's a lot of people unemployed in the community. Think they can sell their house?
Yeah.
Nope, they can't. So, boom, they got this house that they're riding down because the house caught, it's, in other words, their mortgage, they're underwater. Their mortgage is higher than the value of the house. And so they eventually get foreclosed on. So what they wound up doing was buying a junker car on payments, putting what last little stuff they still had, and came to visit Katie. So they're in they're living in their car in the driveway. And the landlady says, "Excuse me, you can't do that." So the second night that they're out on the streets, the Eugene police find them. And of course what they do is they confiscate the car. Now he's stupid enough to argue with this cop who adds resisting arrest to it, slams him to the sidewalk. His face is all cut up and bloody. He's got his knee on his neck and he's handcuffing him. And what was he arguing about? He's arguing about taking their last stuff. This is personal mementos. This is like pictures, family stuff, their clothes, everything else is in the car, confiscated by the police. They, of course, don't have any money to pay the fine. They don't have any money to pay the towing. They don't have any money to pay the daily storage. And now he's got a court date for, resisting arrest. Yeah. Okay, so there they are. Now they are on the streets. They're done. Okay, and
I think that's an increasingly typical story for many people, and that when you talk about which group of people are the fastest expanding group of homeless people, it's families, and it's stories just like you're talking about that are really there. I think that all the stories are indicative of the kind of spot we started is, this kind of limit to capitalism. And I guess I have two comments about that. One is that the economy has to grow in the current framework of a finance-based economy, because if you're talking about debt and you've taken out a loan, you've got something to repay, the assumption is that you'll pay that interest by the growth that takes place in your business or your income from the loan that you've taken out, or the appreciation of the house that you've bought with that loan. And if the economy is such that it's not growing, that means you cannot service those loans, and that's a downward death spiral for a debt-based economy.
But let's talk about it. So what happens is they issue this much money. Okay. Then from there, you produce this much, or maybe you produce a little more in terms of value. But then there's interest, so you owe this much because there's interest added, and the uber rich take some out of that pile. Okay. So now you're behind. So what they have to do is they have to loan you more money so that you'll produce more.
It's a great game. Yeah.
Okay. So you're still always behind because there's interest on all the money that you've taken out. Plus the uber rich take some of it out of it, and you're stuck. So you're always behind. And if we compare the total amount of actual physical assets on the planet, which includes things that you can buy and sell, but it also includes the net present value of future cash flows for companies. In other words, the company is worth what it can produce in terms of profit in the future. The amount of money that's been loaned out is far larger than the total value of all the assets in the society.
Oh, there's no question. I mean, if you, again, going back to the early 1970s when Nixon tied U.S. political power to global finance, that's when he also took the dollar off the fixed exchange rate and ended the gold standard. And when that happened, when he disconnected the exchange rate between Western European countries and the United States and Japan and the United States, that immediately created incentive for a speculative economy. And if you look today and ask yourself how much of the world's economy is attached to the production of real goods and real services, it's about 4.5%. And 95+% of the economy is speculative, which means that we're leveraged at least 20 to 1. On any single asset that we have. And that means the entire economy is a bubble economy. And then when you begin to talk about the economy hitting these limits where it can't grow, then when it begins to spiral downward, all that bubble begins to get pushed out.
So what are the limits?
What are the limits, right? And I think that's why so many people are working to create alternative types of economic activity that bypass the current market, corporate structure, and create direct connections between consumers and producers that are on a local level that basically are viable and sustainable over a long period of time.
Well, that's talking about the silver lining. Okay, so let's talk about the dark cloud for a little bit more. We'll take it one step back. I mean, Nixon had a profound effect on the economy, as you've clearly pointed out. But also there were effects earlier. I mean, one of the things was 1913 was a bumper year. Okay, it was when the outgoing Taft administration left us two things. It left us the federal income tax, and it left us the Fed. Now, the thing is that there's periods in our history where instead of borrowing money into existence, which is what we're doing today, we spent it into existence. And there was no debt, there was no interest attached to that. In other words, we didn't have to pay rich people to use the money that we authorize to create. Okay, so in other words, by creating the Fed, which is not part of the U.S. government, it's a private bank, okay, with stockholders and all that good stuff happening, and we are paying interest to those people to use the money that's our money that we allowed to be created through a fractional reserve banking system, and so we have a problem there. In other words, Nixon coming along sort of compounds a problem that already exists and was quite serious by that time.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can look at that whole era of the 20th century and say, as you go from one president to the next, that they're basically dealing with those dynamics that you just described. I mean, even Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is portrayed as the great progressive, and in many ways he was, but really the progressive movement was designed to stall off socialism in this country. And he essentially made a bargain between labor and business that would allow the labor to have some minimal voices, some minimal spot at the table, but not a revolutionary spot, and allow capital to stay in control of the economic system. So it was essentially, we call it progressive, but it was essentially a conservative movement.
But still at the same time, his administration implemented a very steeply graduated income tax. Prior to the Great Depression, it was a flat tax, okay, and which of course falls much more heavily on those least able to pay. So I mean, let's say you got 10% of your income, if you're the uber rich, it's, well, okay, maybe I can't buy an additional yacht this year. But if you're, a small you're a couple raising kids and stuff, that's, that 10%'s pretty hefty because you don't have as much discretionary spending because you need to buy food, you need to buy housing,
or whatever. Any discretionary spending.
Precisely. So the income tax was one of the factors that kind of vacuum cleaned the wealth out of the working class and led to the Great Depression. So in response, my grandparents' generation said, excuse me, we're going to put a steep graduated income tax and limit the concentration of wealth within the country. So so what happened is during the Great Depression, there were, I've heard the number 20 to 25 billionaires in the United States, and that's back when $1 billion was actually worth something. Okay, and so we move on from there to the 1950s, and because of the graduated income tax, very, very high rate on the highest, tax bracket, there were no billionaires during the 1950s. They had been removed from the economy. Combination of, inheritance, splitting it between people, so that, a lot of that wealth was still there, but there were no single individuals having that concentration.
You think of the period right after World War II when the nominal income tax was 90%. Now, they didn't always pay that much because, of course, there were various tax breaks and loopholes that were utilized.
But that was only on the highest bracket.
But that was, still the nominal tax rate was 90%.
And then John Kennedy considered a liberal, essentially reduced that to 72% and began the reconcentration of wealth within the society. And so since then, we've seen, Reagan or Nixon brought it down some, Reagan brought it down more, et cetera, until working people are actually paying an effective higher tax rate than the uber rich, because a lot of the income on the uber rich is in capital gains, which is charged at an even lower rate.
Yeah, it's clear, for example, here in Oregon, if you look at the actual amount of income tax as a percentage of your income that you pay, Oregon's tax system is actually regressive. You pay a higher percentage of your income in taxes if you're at the lowest level in terms of income that you generate than people at the very top level, and that's a line that goes regressively all the way up from the poorest to the richest. So, here we are.
And here we'll have Art Robinson fighting against DeFazio again, making the suggestion that we need an even lower tax rate for rich people. But at the same time, you can bring up in his presence, and it sort of bounces off the fact that during the 1950s, we had massive expansion of the economy, the working class participating in that, and we had a very high tax rate. Now we've got stagnation and a low tax rate, which is precisely the opposite situation, and yet the low tax rate that's producing the stagnation, because it allows them to consolidate huge amounts of capital and ship it over to China.
Well, plus if you look at the structure of the economy, both in the United States and outside the United States, and look at the productive capacity of the factories that are out there, they're not working to full productive capacity. So if you have factories that are working at about 75% of productive capacity, if you give a tax break to a wealthy corporation, they're not going to take that money and invest it into more productive facilities, because they've already got more productive facilities than they need.
Precisely.
So what are you going to do with that money? You're going to take it and you're going to speculate with it. I mean, you talked about the Feds recently. Recently the Feds have been engaging in this process that they call quantitative easing, which is literally, basically creating money out of thin air and loaning it to, banks and at a rate that's somewhere between 0 and 1%, so at extraordinarily low rates, with the rhetoric that that's designed to get the banks to be encouraged to start loaning money again. But in fact, those banks are taking that money and engaging in currency speculation. We've been, as a country, pressing China to revalue its currency upwards to about 20% in value. And if you've taken money that you've gotten from the Federal Reserve for less than 1% and invested in the currency speculation, and the value of Chinese currency goes up 20%, you've made trillions and trillions of dollars by speculating. And that's another bubble that's not connected to anything tangible in terms of real production and real services.
Well, it represents a money machine.
A money machine, but it's not connected to anything real. I mean, in that case, it's literally not connected to anything real, since all these currencies are no longer connected to any kind of gold standard or silver standard. They're all fiat currencies that value depends entirely upon the willingness of people to use them to engage in trade and speculation. And, so literally when you're speculating in money on money, there's literally nothing there that's actually securing the transaction that you're doing.
Yeah. See, money originally started out as a claim on the assets of the society, as a means of interchange to simplify things. But now that we have so much money in circulation, so many assets that people hold, which are a claim. In other words, we have this huge pile of financial assets which are a claim on this smaller number of real assets. So that we got that problem going. We have a whole series of those kinds of things. Let's get to peace. So why are we really, why is it that the United States really has 800 plus military bases in 130 plus countries?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think there are a number of reasons, but I can go back to the one that we already were talking about, which is finance capitalism. I think that if you look at the United States in the post-World War II era, that what you discovered is that there was the old money, which is basically Wall Street money, the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the people that are sometimes called originated as the robber barons, that basically went through that period that we described of the stock market crash and then the government regulation, and discovered during that period that actually business is pretty healthy that way. Right?
Yeah.
But then after World War II, when Eisenhower warned against the rise of the military-industrial media complex, that what you saw is new money beginning to emerge, new wealth, which was attached to the production of military equipment and military services to service this new standing army or military branches that came into existence in 1947 with the National Security Act. And so you had two types of wealth competing, elite wealth competing with one another. And in the 1980s, they came together because in the 1980s, Reagan was the first president elected with military-industrial complex money, and he then engaged in a high level of deficit spending to increase the level of the military, which told the banks, oh, this is a debt machine because they're deficit spending to create this military establishment. We should engage in working together. If we can create a permanent war economy, this is going to be a permanent debt-based economy, and this is going to be great for us. And this merger of these two things basically means essentially that the interests of both groups are to have perpetual war as an economic framework.
Yeah. But again, we have there's the procurement of materials, there's services procured, there's all that kind of stuff that's manufactured largely by large corporations, generating a substantial profit. But here's a quick question for you. Can you earn a profit in a competitive market?
Well, again, I guess the question is, what is a competitive market, right? Because if you go back to actually reading somebody like Adam Smith, who is the one that's always quoted about the invisible hand of the market leading to optimal results, he was talking about a market where there were many producers and many consumers.
Exactly.
So when you went out to engage in a transaction, a rational consumer or a rational producer would not enter into a bargain that was bad for them.
Yep.
And so when they refused to enter the bargain, they had some other spot to go to bargain with somebody else that could be a fair bargain as a result, hence the market leading to an optimal outcome, the invisible hand of the market leading to optimal results. But when you look at today's economy, what you're seeing is that not only is production planned, but distribution is planned as well. So it's really a planned economy with virtually, you really can't talk about it as competition in the same way that you would talk about a true market-based competition, because everything is really planned.
Okay.
I would like to talk a little bit more about the Peace Symposium.
Let's go to that. So it's been kind of an interesting random conversation, but yeah.
Everything that's in this Peace Symposium will relate to this conversation that we've had. We have a number of people coming in. Ben Mansky was the person when he was in college in Madison that founded the Movement for the Democratization of Education, MDE 180. And he's done a lot of work on the corporatization of higher education. And of course that fits right into the framework that we're talking about. He's also happens to be the campaign manager for Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate for president, and is heavily involved in the Wisconsin Wave, which is part of the recall efforts of the various politicians, including Governor Walker in Madison or in Wisconsin, to turn Wisconsin around back to its actually radical roots that it had, not just progressive, but radical roots that it had. And then we have Ms. George Friday, who is one of the co-founders of United for Peace and Justice. She works with the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. She also is part of the Independent Progressive Political Network, the coordinator for that. And she has a specialty of building multiracial social movements. And I think that's extraordinarily interesting because if we look at successful social movements in this country, the really successful social movements have always been on the heels of racial movements for justice. So if you look at the Civil War and the abolition movement, the labor movement sought to join in the abolition movement, saying that wage labor was a form of wage slavery. And so the 13th Amendment would have ended that if they had been successful. The women's movement sought to join in the 14th Amendment on equal protection. They were unsuccessful, but both those movements then took the abolition movement as a leverage point to move forward and get for women the right to vote, and for the labor movement eventually the gains they made under Roosevelt, certainly not as big as they would have got if wage labor had been considered slave labor, but still massive gains. And if you look then after World War II, of course, big movement was the civil rights movement, and those civil rights movement provided the foundations for the environmental movement, the anti-war movement. All those movements basically had a foundation in the civil rights movement. And so one of the things that I think all movements that are progressive movements have to come to terms with is they have to come to terms with addressing these foundational issues of people of color as necessary to their own success.
Yeah. But let's talk about the anti-war movement for a minute.
Okay.
I mean, one of the things that people think about is they say, oh, well, after World War II, we had the Korean War, and then we had Vietnam. I mean, that's it. I mean, what are you complaining about? It's only 2 wars. Okay? I mean, there's a different reality if you look a little closer. I mean, we moved troops, into the Dominican Republic. We moved troops into Haiti. We moved into Peru.
Guatemala.
We went all over the place.
Cuba.
Yeah.
The difference during that time is that stuff was mostly done covertly, under the guise of the CIA. People may or may not know that, once the National Security Act was passed, which also not only created the 4 branches of the military, but created the CIA and the National Security Council, that in 1954, the first coup that took place was in Iran, where Mossadegh, the democratically elected leader of Iran, was deposed to bring back the Shah.
One would not want to nationalize the oil industry.
That's right.
Would one?
And so, we begin to trace that history forward. That led to eventually in 1979, the overthrow of the Shah of Iran and the rise of the first fundamentalist Islamic State. And that was really blowback for the, years not only of overthrowing a democratically elected government, but militarily supporting a government that repressed heavily its own people under the Shah, which then, of course, led us to become an ally to Saddam Hussein, which fought a proxy war against Iran, and then all these kinds of things that lead to where we're at now.
But I mean, energy is a good example of that question of can you make a profit in a competitive market? And the answer to that is no.
Yeah.
Okay. In other words, Adam Smith's magic invisible guiding hand, what it does is, in a competitive market, if other people see, whoa, this guy's making a profit, they will enter your marketplace, thereby increasing supply, thereby lowering price until the profit is removed. And that's how the magic
the market's supposed to work.
Magic invisible guiding hand works. So you can't make a profit unless there's a shortage. And so the object is to manufacture a shortage. For example, one of the things, the result of the first Gulf War was to reduce the amount of oil that Iraq was putting into the world. And so what that did was you reduce supply, it raises the price. Same thing happened in '73 when the Arabs said, hey, we're going to cut back on supply, the price goes up. But what happened prior to that is the oil companies cutting back on supply. And the price went up, and then it's kind of like the Arabs are saying, wait a second, they're making a lot of money, we'll get in on this act too. And so we had that 73 and 79. Then, we find a reason. I mean, Saddam Hussein, he invaded Kuwait, he's so horrible, blah, blah, blah. We got to go kill a lot of people and thereby shut it off and raise the price. So we come to the next Gulf War. Okay, when we went into Iraq, did we turn the oil on, the spigots on, or did we turn them off? We turned them off. And what happened to gas prices? Went from between $1 and $1.50 a gallon up to, $3 a gallon, pretty quickly. Now, the interesting thing is the rise that we're seeing right now is due to resource limitations. We've passed peak oil. In other words, the point at which we've consumed half the oil on the planet, the point at which we will never have production as high as that again.
Yeah, I totally agree with you.
In June of 2008. So we're getting on towards 4 years past that.
Yeah, I actually think that the peak was somewhere around 2005. If you look at the production quotas or production statistics that are out there, you see that since 2005, production levels have essentially been flat, and that despite attempts to increase production.
Yeah, you can argue that it happened then or then.
Yeah, it doesn't make any difference. But
it's a flat area. It's
the point is that we have crossed that peak oil line, and the longer they're able to keep that plateau flat at the top by using artificial means to pump what's there out, the steeper will be the decline when the time comes that they find that those wells are basically no longer able to produce oil.
But how convenient that we've run a major worldwide recession at this particular moment. Is it, which is the cause? Is the recession reducing the oil, or is the oil causing the recession, or do they mix against each other?
And I think that's an interesting question, and there's this aspect that you talked about that relates to it being a managed framework about how much is coming out and how much isn't.
So let's talk some more about this beast. Okay, so we have the war stuff. Okay, so George Friday, who's he?
That's a she. That's the woman I just talked about. That's the specialty is building multiracial social movements. And David Cobb, he is the spokesperson for Move to Amend. And of course, really, you can argue that the heart of this beast is the recognition of corporations as persons for purposes of constitutional rights. And the Move to Amend group, of course, is organizing to create not just a constitutional amendment to end corporate personhood, but really a series of amendments that would be a new social contract with America. And actually, they're going to be not only presenting keynotes, but they're going to be on Saturday doing a series of workshops that are organizing workshops on this exact topic, to organize, to create a community-based movement to amend the Constitution to end corporate rights.
So we're actually talking about a fairly interesting group of people who are going to bring a wide range of information into the public that's generally not there.
Yeah, that's true. And we haven't talked about our latest edition, which is Max Rameau, who is the founder of the Take Back the Land movement. And that's a movement that's either trying to block foreclosures from happening by surrounding homes and preventing the foreclosures from taking place, where they've already taken place and homes are vacant, by moving homeless people into those homes. And what could be more appropriate? You have an economic system that's displaced people and created assets that are empty, homes to be occupied, and people who have been displaced, so moving people back into the spaces they're there instead of having them be on the streets and having the properties depreciate in value and fall apart.
Yeah, the last time I looked, there were 5,975 houses that were up for auction at the moment that have been foreclosed, and that's in Eugene City alone, and that's more than the number of homeless. I mean, it's a staggering statistic. It's just it becomes as we talked a little bit before about if you have your really rich people over here and your poor people, it's the distribution of wealth instead of being flat is like doing this. And as it gets more steep, these people at this end are dropping off totally. They're the ones, being foreclosed on. Bankruptcies, oops, too bad, we're not going to pay your medical insurance anymore because you're poor and you're not going to, you can't sue us anyway, so too bad. That kind of stuff. I mean, one of the sad statistics is, I guess it's a few years ago, it was 29,000 people a year were dying from refusal of service. Now it's over 100,000.
Yeah, it's outrageous, isn't it?
It's insane. And this is people who've paid into the system, they bought the insurance, they did what they were supposed to do, and the companies just say, hey, too bad, we're not going to pay.
Yeah.
You know, you're a loss and we're
writing you off and goodbye.
Yeah, exactly. We got your money, you lose. So we find that kind of, I mean, I would call that corruption.
I do too. I think the whole system is corrupt. You know, I really agree with the writings that Sheldon Wolin has put out recently called Democracy Incorporated, where he's talking about a system that is, he calls it inverted totalitarianism, where it's a totalizing system and where government has been captured by the corporate military framework and is dictating what's happening in society. And that is essentially the dismantling of the social welfare state and the projection of power globally, and taking that global projection of power and at some point turning it inward on ourselves so that there is no spot that is not subjected to the same dynamic.
Yeah. And you look at sort of, I mean, as people are getting dropped off the bottom, I mean, who are those people at the bottom? You know, a lot of them are the Tea Party. Okay? In other words, these people who are running around supporting the policies of the uber rich at their own peril. In other words, the more they support it, the more, you know, they and their neighbors are losing their jobs.
Certainly that's
and
true
losing their houses and whatever.
A particular segment of the Tea Party. I don't think it's true as a whole, but for
well, there's people at this end.
Right, yeah.
Okay, but the ones down here, you know.
So I also don't want to get out of here without mentioning the last of our guests that are going to be at the symposium. David West is the director of the Native American Studies program at the Southern Oregon University, and he's going to be talking about sacred lands that resist corporatization and militarization.
Okay.
And again, talk about a group that when you talk about getting down to foundational levels of oppression in this country, that's number one at the start of the country. And then we're going to have some music. We're going to have Alice DiMichele in to provide some music during some breaks during the time that this is happening. So we'll mix a little bit of culture in with the organizing and the speechifying to give it a softer edge. Yeah,
well, that's good. Actually, I've been at the last couple conferences. They've been very, very interesting. But been with Stan Taylor this evening, and I want to thank you for joining us. And come back next week for another episode of Occupy TV.
Do we have time for the website name?
Oh, sorry, yes. So it's www.lanecc.edu/Peace Center. Okay, if you're looking for more information and the schedule. Thank you.
Thank you.
There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that?